Before we can move forward and work on more of our application, I'd like to talk a little bit about operators. Now, operators is one of the really big features of observables, and we can use operators to manipulate the data. Right now, this looks pretty similar to how a promise would look. We would have the HTTP call, we would have a .then, and then we would just manipulate the data however we needed and use it inside of this function. Now, for our purposes, we want to do a little bit better. We want to use more of the observable features. So what we can do is we're going to bring in an operator called map. And what map does is it's going to take the data that we have and we can manipulate it and pass it back so that our HTTP call is just going to reformat the data however we want. Really what this means is right now we're getting data, but it's not really the data we want. We have to go in and do data.json so that we can get the actual information out of this response. And then once we look at the response here, we have .data, and this is where the users are. This is finally where we get our users. So this is what we want. We want to get the .data after that. Wouldn't it be great that once we subscribe, we already know that this is actually users instead of data? We can totally do that with an operator. Before we get to this subscribe section, we can map response, and then we'll take response.json.data. So now we are taking the HTTP call, we're taking the response and mapping it. So we're going to take the data and map it how we want. And finally, when we get to subscribe to this observable, we actually have the users, and we can just say, we can clean all of that up and say this.users is equal to users. Isn't that a lot cleaner than what we had before? And we can really see the flow of how our data is moving. We get the call, we map it, and then we subscribe to it. Now the reason we are seeing this error here is map doesn't exist on observable type yet. Now observables are very modular, and we have to bring in the operators that we want to use. This is really helpful because the RxJS observable library is actually pretty large, and we want to keep our application as lean as possible. If we take a look at node modules and we scroll all the way down to RxJS, which is where observables live, and here we go, RxJS, and we look at add, under the operator folder here, we can see all of the operators we have access to. Audit, buffer, let's find some cool ones. Concat, we can combine some information. Count. So a lot of these things are going to simplify how we manipulate our data. Find is a really good way to filter and find one specific thing. And there's also filter, which is also filtering. So filter will return multiple, find will return one. Instead of taking the users and then trying to filter them out and finding a specific user, we can actually just pipe this through and say find. Here, find is going to give us the value, which is the user, and the key, and we'll take that and we'll say user.name, no, that's first name, is equal to, and we'll go and say George. So that will go ahead, find the specific user that we want, and now once we subscribe to it, we know that we only have one user. Really, really cool way to filter through our data and see exactly how we're manipulating it. Let's remove this, we don't want that, but we do want map because we want to say that we're mapping this data in our specific way. Since we want to use the map operator, we have to go to the very top and import. We're going to bring in the entire file here. We'll just do RxJS add operator map. Now that we have that specific operator added, we can go down. Our error no longer exists. And let's take a look at our app. Our users are brought in just like they were before. So this is a very simple example of how we can stream through our data and manipulate it using operators. And I would definitely encourage you to go to the reactive website, reactivex.io, and take a look at the operators. There's some really cool ones that you can use to use data, your asynchronous data, as collections and maneuver through your data like that. One of the really fun ones, if you wanted to go all the way back to what we were using before. Actually, let's grab this information. We can use .toPromise, and that is also an operator, and then .then data, and let's see what the data looks like here. But we also need toPromise, so we'll bring in that operator. And let's go console log what's going on in our app. And here we see that we have the same exact information that we had before when we had an observable. If you really don't want to go the observables way, you can just use toPromise and treat everything like it was a promise and go back to the way things were with Angular 1's HTTP library. Right now, since we don't want that, we'll delete that and we'll come back here and bring that in. One last thing I want to do when we're talking about operators is we're importing these operators here inside of app component. While it's okay to let them live here, since app component is going to encompass our entire app, so these operators would apply to our entire app, I like improving this and bringing those into app module. This is where we import everything for our entire app, so I think it makes sense to put these here. Right now we have map and toPromise. We'll add to this list a little bit later, but right now I think that's a good overview of how operators work. Is we can clean up our data and we can really see how things flow through our application. Next up, let's start building a user service and use all of the HTTP information that we've learned so far.